Hello, welcome everyone. We're going to wait a few more minutes here for other people to join, so just bear with us. Hi everyone again. We have a lot of interest in this webinar today, which is great. We don't want to start too early though. So we have only about a third have joined the webinar so far of those who have registered. So we'll wait another minute or so before we get started. Thanks. Okay, so we'll start the webinar in about one more minute. Again, we have a lot of people joining this webinar who have registered. We've got about a third of that, or a little over a third of those who registered. So we're going to hold out for one more minute. Thanks. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Title of our webinar today is Funding Attacks on Dissent, the Millionaires and Billionaires Behind Anti-Protest Legislation in the States. Before we get started, I want to give a very special thanks to our friend Sophia at Piper Fund for helping us on the tech side. So you can view this webinar from your desk or your sofa, iPhone, iPad, whatever, and hopefully everything runs smoothly. My name is David Armiak. I'm a researcher and writer with the Center for Media and Democracy. I will be moderating and presenting in the webinar today. It's clear that the right to protest is under assault. State legislators, many of whom have ties to the corporate bill mill, the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, are passing laws targeting protesters on university campuses or pipeline routes, public spaces, many with severe penalties. One bill, the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, created in reaction to the Dakota Access Pipeline demonstrations, is designed to squash protests of pipelines and fracking. The laws differ in severity of penalties, but they all using the term critical infrastructure to demonize protesters as seeking to sabotage citizens' security in their targeting of so-called critical infrastructure. Some proponents of these bills have gone so far as to call protesters terrorists. A very informative webinar was held specifically on this topic last year that will be linked to when this webinar is posted online. Greenpeace's Connor Gibson did a thorough job detailing the funding of these bills as part of that webinar. So for the sake of time, we urge those interested to view his part in particular. Another, the so-called campus free speech bill, creates academic and or legal sanctions for students whose protests are perceived to, quote, disrupt the free speech of others, specifically speakers invited to campus. The bill is based on a manufactured premise that there is a free speech crisis on campuses, while there's very little proof, that this is the case. Finally, anti-boycott, divestment, and sanction bills seek to criminalize an effective form of dissent, the boycott. In particular, the bills target supporters of Palestinian rights who have used the legal tactics of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, known as the BDS movement, to put pressure on the state of Israel to end the oppression of Palestinians. For those interested in following these anti-protest bills as they move through the states, the International Center for Nonprofit Law maintains a US protest law tracker on its website, and Palestine Legal maintains an anti-BDS law tracker on theirs. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Ralph Wilson and Max Koehler to provide some insight into the major funders behind this attack on dissent. Ralph is the co-founder of Corporate Genome Project and former research director and co-founder of Uncoke My Campus. Max is an organizer with the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. Ralph will speak first with a focus on the money behind campus free speech bills. Then I will speak on the Bradley Foundation's effort in this right-wing assault on dissent. And then Max will dive into the money propping up the anti-BDS movement. Following all the presentations, we'll take questions through Zoom. You can ask questions at any time during the webinar, and we will attempt to answer them at the conclusion of Max's talk. Okay, Ralph, you ready? All right.
Thank you so much, David. Can everyone hear me? Cool. So today, I'd like to talk about what turns out to be a fairly complicated structure that is creating this free speech crisis, as David just described. There's a lot of talk in media or headlines, especially far-right media outlets, that claim that there is a problem with free speech on campus. But if you start to scratch the surface of what's being reported, what's being claimed, all of the elements involved have ties to the same network of funders. And so just for clarity, David will speak more about this, but essentially, Charles Koch has convened a large network of donors. They meet in secret twice a year. He refers to them as the Seminar Network. And this is a very large and growing group of millionaires and billionaires, corporate interests, who pool their money and do joint fundraising and then coordinate their spending across the country. And so, as I said, when you start to scratch the surface and look at the money behind the elements in this false crisis, it all leads back to this very powerful network and their co-funders. So I'd just like to run through a few of the pieces that really are making up this crisis, and then talk about some of the how these bills actually serve the donors in particular. So from scratch, what we see a lot in the headlines is some university has a very controversial speaker come. So your Milo Yiannopoulos, your Charles Murray, your Ben Shapiro, and these speakers come to campus and trigger counter demonstrations to the messages that they bring. Very often these messages are inherently deadly, denying the existence of transgendered persons, advancing eugenics or white supremacy, et cetera. These kinds of things are not academically sound ideas, and the speakers that come to campus are not academics, and they're not presenting their material in good faith as academics to engage in the academic process. Their conclusions are predetermined, and they merely serve to propagate these ideas. So there's basically a network of speaker provocateurs who are touring around the country. And when you look at the funders of those tours, it's usually nonprofits like your Young Americans Foundation, Young Americans for Liberty, Turning Point USA, a lot of nonprofits who are structured in such a way that they use campus chapters or campus affiliates to basically provide a foundation where they can get invitations from their student members and find their way onto campus. What then happens is, as per the design, so it would seem there is a predictable counter demonstration to these or demonstration to these speakers, and what then happens is you have a bunch of media outlets that amplify the existence of these demonstrations. With lines like speakers attacked, or just very much exaggerate the occurrences. When you start to look at which media outlets are actually amplifying or creating these messages, and their funders, again, the funding in common, at least with that they have with these other nonprofits, it goes back to the Koch network. So you have Koch family foundations, their anonymous pass-through, donor advised funds, other donors in that network. So they're funding nonprofits that put out the speaker provocateurs. They're funding the media outlets that then amplify the intentional response. And then you have these, following all these incidences, you have litigation groups. The most recent one is called Speech First. But you have essentially a group of maybe 4 or 5 different litigation groups that are then suing policies, free speech policies that they disagree with, or specifically suing around the occurrence of a protest with one of their speaker provocateurs. So, for example, Ben Shapiro with Young Americans Foundation has been around the country and has been, his appearance has been the basis of a lawsuit, on several campuses. And the groups that represent, for example, Young Americans Foundation, include Alliance Defending Freedom, several groups that are, directly aligned with hate groups or themselves are picking up this effort. So you have nonprofits and speaker provocateurs who trigger protests that are amplified by far-right media outlets. And then retaliation, you have these litigation groups that come and sue universities based on the amplified message of failing to protect free speech. And and this is kind of one piece. And now what you have and why we're speaking about this is several other nonprofits with the same funders have produced legislation that is basically designed to address this false crisis that they all just manufactured. So, for example, the Goldwater Institute, or as it said, the American Legislative Exchange Council, have produced model legislation that has spread very quickly around the country. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And so the premise of this legislation is this manufactured crisis, but it also serves to shoehorn more crisis and more litigation. And so just kind of briefly, I can talk about some of the provisions in these bills, and in particular why these donors are interested in the passage of these bills, why such a thing would be manufactured in the first place. It's not just trolling for trolling's sake, So in a way that's very similar to Citizens United, these same donors are looking for more access to political capital for cheaper. And after essentially maxing out their ability to spend in political races through Citizens United and other Supreme Court rulings, the next, well, a very important piece of their political agenda is the college campus. And it bears mentioning this very explicit strategy used by the Charles Koch Foundation and shared by his donor network is referred to as the structure of social change. It's written by an early political captain of president of the Charles Koch Foundation, a guy named Richard Fink. But basically, the strategy is about how to leverage universities, think tanks, and political operatives all in an integrated way. And so, you know, you want to be able to pour as much money into each of these avenues as you want. Something like Citizens United has allowed a tremendous amount of money to flow into the political arena. The next place that speech needs to be deregulated for their efforts is the college campus. This is, you know, these bills basically open the floodgates for this network's dark money to come onto campus, to subsidize, you know, their messaging on campus with speakers, the creation of programming that creates and spreads propaganda that trains and recruits students to work as operatives in this network, et cetera. So just like Citizens United deregulated speech, political speech, based on a flawed understanding of free speech, these campus free speech bills contain a flawed understanding of free speech in order to deregulate it on campus. And in fact, several of these bills specifically seek to deregulate the nature of speech on campus. So for example, a public park is what's considered a traditional public forum. And according to the First Amendment, the government is not allowed to regulate speech by content or by viewpoint. Whereas what are called limited public forums, so a courtroom, Senate floor, different places like this, universities can regulate based on content but not viewpoint. And what several of these bills specifically seek to do is redefine universities as much as possible as completely traditional public fora, completely deregulate speech on campus as much as possible. And this essentially is what gives them a backdoor to basically flood campuses with their political messaging and political operation. I mean, the other thing that shoehorns more of this crisis are provisions in these bills that prevent campuses from disinviting speakers once they've been invited. It's kind of like a vampire being invited into your house. It's an irreversible provision, and all you need is maybe a student or faculty. One single person put on campus can create an irreversible invitation to someone like Milo Yiannopoulos, Charles Murray, a member of the KKK. Basically it's you can imagine what such a provision would allow for, and the kind of free speech fights that would continue out of this. This is not a manufactured problem with a solution. It's a manufactured problem with a false solution that perpetuates the manufactured problem. And I mean, so other provisions in these bills, serve donors in other more ideological ways. For example, groups with firmly held beliefs, for example, religious student groups, are allowed to discriminate based on those firmly held beliefs. So, for example, barring membership to students based on, whether they're LGBTQ or in general, whether they live up to whatever the firmly held standards come along with those firmly held beliefs. And so this would bypass, provisions on campus, which prevent student groups from discriminating against any students on campus. The other thing is that make this particularly draconian and just obviously dangerous are the precedents set for claiming that someone disrupting your speech is a violation of your free speech because it happened on a college campus or a public institution. What this does is redefines a tremendous amount of constitutionally protected speech as unprotected, or basically as able to be retaliated against. And what these bills also do in varying degrees is create incredibly harsh punishments, and in many cases mandatory minimums for those punishments, be it financial penalty, or expulsion from your academic institution. So so these various provisions in these bills serve the donors in several different ways. I'm really interested in which provisions are going where. I'm not sure if David will talk about this, but there's a bill that's been produced by the Goldwater Institute. There's a bill that's been produced by the American Legislative Exchange Council. And initially they were very different. Well, they were somewhat different. The Goldwater bill was a bit more radical and a bit more harsh. And the ALEC bill seemed to be a nicer bill. And so the network is so big that they can basically play good bill, bad bill against each other, until late December, when ALEC updated its bill, and in fact now mirrors the language of the Goldwater bill. So in a good bill, bad bill switcheroo, you now have a tremendous amount of sympathy for the ALEC bill, the better bill, that has now been displaced by the language, in effect, of the Goldwater bill. You had a tremendous amount of, what appeared to be false opposition from the Charles Koch Foundation and Charles Koch Institute itself that came out against particular provisions of the Goldwater bill, saying, well, maybe these mandatory minimums go a bit too far. And so this effort is so large that they, not only are there multiple versions of these bills, but you have the donors behind these bills, taking duplicitous positions on the bills, and that went too far. But it's the network as a whole is pushing this forward, and so it's I guess worth mentioning that it's not just kind of these straightforward political entities that are carrying this effort, but actually when you look even further behind some of these people, there's a good number of pernicious PR firms that are helping advance this. And you also have the shortcomings of these public arguments. Now the gaps are being filled in by the use of opinion polls to provide empirical evidence that in fact, yes, there is a crisis. So there's a lot of moving pieces to this crisis. And what's nice about it is that when you look at the money, it kind of all goes back to the same place. So I'll stop there. Happy to answer any questions after.
Great. Thank you, Ralph. All right, so as I said before, I'm going to speak to the Bradley Foundation's role in all of this. For those who are unaware, the $900 million plus Milwaukee-based Lynn and Harry Bradley Foundation has weaponized philanthropy and has contributed a large amount of funds to the right-wing effort to attack the right to protest, both directly and indirectly. The Bradley Foundation organizes itself as a tax-exempt charitable foundation under the 501c3 tax code, and pursues a highly partisan game plan, funding and infrastructure, and they actually use this term in internal communications on the right that benefits the Republican Party, while at the same time attempting to crush the supporters of the Democratic Party. CMD, the Center for Meaningful Democracy, has found this through months-long analysis of internal documents that we were able to look at from the foundation. The entire story of what we found would really take hours to detail. So I urge those who are interested in this talk to visit our site, exposedbycmd.org, and read through our Bradley Files investigation. We've also uploaded much of our research and analysis to our SourceWatch wiki. But here's the short history. The Bradley brothers, Lynn and Harry, started the foundation in 1942 to aid needy families in Milwaukee. Their wealth came from the Allen Bradley Company, which developed early resistors for electrical products. Then in 1985, the company was bought by the defense contractor Rockwell International, and the foundation's assets, increased from 14 million to $290 million after the sale of Allen Bradley to Rockwell for $1.65 billion. And it was at that time that Bradley hired Michael S. Joyce from the right-wing Allen Foundation to run its operations and engage in what Joyce called the war of ideas. Bradley now seems to prefer the phrase culture wars. Joyce was on Reagan's transition team and was an advisor to the Bushes. From 2002 to 2016, the prominent Republican attorney, Michael Grebe, took over as CEO and president of the foundation. Grebe's Republican credentials are very impressive and well known, in particular here in the state of Wisconsin. He was former general counsel to the Republican National Committee from 1996 to 2000, and the Republican National Committeeman for Wisconsin from 1984 to 2002. He chaired Scott Walker, our former governor's campaign for governor in 2010, 2012, his reelection in 2014. All this time he was, chairman of the Bradley Foundation. And also, maybe some of you recall, but it was a very short time while Walker ran for the White House back in 2015, right? But in 2013, Bradley received even more money, a $203 million donation from the Caroline Bradley Trust. Caroline Bradley was Lynn Bradley's wife, and Sarah Bader was her adopted daughter. So when Barter passed away, that money was given to the Bradley Foundation. And so under Grebe, Bradley used a large portion of this money to build a right-wing infrastructure. A graph in the Barter board meeting files, so they would hold special meetings, to think about and consider what to do with this large injection of cash. Show that 20% of Bradley's state infrastructure and grant making went out of state in 2011, but by 2013 that number had grown to 56%, and could be likely higher today in 2019. But it was in 2014, shortly after they got this funding, that Bradley sent out a call, quote, for proposals to restore academic integrity to elite higher education, end quote, indicating a renewed focus on higher ed funded by the Barter donation. Bradley staff rationalizes this funding in an effort to move higher education further right in the following manner. And this is kind of a long quote, bear with me, but it's very enlightening. For generations, American conservatives have had an understandably uneasy relationship with higher education. While almost everyone recognizes the undeniable importance of a college or university degree for employment and economic well-being, conservatives have become justifiably convinced that too many college and university campuses are basically ideological indoctrination mills designed to convert impressionable young students into lifelong supporters of the left. Relatedly, faculty members are unfairly denied academic freedom, and faculty and students are unfairly denied free speech and equal rights at too many campuses, end quote. The internal documents do not reveal who received specific grants as a result of this call, but some of the groups active on campuses, as Ralph mentioned in his presentation, received support from Bradley. Then in 2016, planning notes for the Koehler Impact Conference, formerly called the Koehler Action Conference under the subheading Themes and Topics, Bradley staff places, quote, freedom of speech on college campuses, parentheses, suppression of free speech on campus, end parentheses, as the first bullet point. Staff adds for suppression of free speech in parentheses an acknowledgement that readers may be confused by the choice of words, since speech is already protected under the First Amendment, right? And Bradley states further in the document that when the topic of free speech on college campuses is discussed at the conference, that, quote, the root of the problem should be considered. Quote, lack of free speech on campus is a symptom of the root, which is the left dominates in its campus influence, end quote, the staff writes. The Koehler Conference attracts a large number of right-wing wealthy donors on a smaller scale than the Koch's Seminar Network or Donor Network summits. CMD doesn't have internal documents beyond August 2016, but knowing this and seeing how the campus free speech bills moved, starting with Goldwater, Bradley likely played a role. Bradley has developed a close relationship with Goldwater since Clint Bullock moved there. Now he's an Arizona Supreme Court justice. And Bullock was the founder of the Institute for Justice. Bradley helped and provided the funding for Goldwater to set up a litigation alliance in the states. This litigation center push is part of and coordinated with the larger effort of several Bradley Foundation funded organizations, all pushing to advance a right-wing agenda that includes defunding public schools, and involving charter and voucher initiatives, defunding and otherwise fighting labor unions, fighting environmental regulations, particularly those that restrict oil and coal companies, fighting the Affordable Care Act, fighting campaign finance laws, and generally fighting government. The litigation centers are an integral part of the, quote, conservative infrastructure, end quote. Bradley has spent millions setting up in the states to protect the model bills that pass state legislators and are challenged, and are often housed in state policy network affiliates in the states. For those who aren't aware of the State Policy Network, it's a web of right-wing think tanks and tax-exempt organizations in 49 states, Washington, D.C., Canada, and the United Kingdom. As of March, their membership totaled 162 groups. Bradley has provided close to $1 million in grants to Goldwater in our investigation into Bradley's funding of SPN that we published back in 2017. Found that the network organizations received $133 million. As Ralph mentions in his talk, ALEC's campus free speech bill, the Forum Act, followed Goldwater's, but now closely resembles it, right? Through 2016, Bradley gave ALEC $1.3 million, but it increased its support of the cookie cutter bill mill in 2017, providing $550,000 in grants. Since CMD's ALEC Exposed investigation was published, 112 companies have dropped out of ALEC. Most recently, some of its biggest funders in Exxon, AT&T, and Verizon. We have reason to believe that Bradley and the Kochs are stepping in to help with funding. Late last year at ALEC's State and Nation Summit, Bradley held its first Bradley Foundation breakfast at ALEC, suggesting that the ties between the two are deepening. And ALEC, of course, helped spread the Critical Infrastructure Act. The first version, HB 1123 and HB 2128, appeared in Oklahoma in early 2017. The latter was introduced by a registered ALEC member, Representative Charles McCall. The ALEC model bill combines these two bills into one, was introduced into the Energy, Environment, and Agricultural Task Force later in the year. It's worth noting that Bradley funds a web of climate change deniers, spending millions on so-called energy policy centers, many of which are housed also in SPN think tanks. Bradley has also funded smear campaigns like Richard Berman, or as some people call him, Dr. Evil, his Big Green Radical Group, and also climate disinformation centers like the CO2 Coalition and its predecessor, the George C. Marshall Institute. CO2 Coalition just had, its head, Hopper, nominated for a special climate advisory board of Trump's, right? Well, I can't say that Bradley has funded the anti-BDS movement specifically. It has, I should say, and maybe Max can speak more to this, funded ALEC, which has a 2016 model bill titled Protection and Enforcement Against the Commercial Exclusion of Israel Act. The bill was circulated by Wisconsin State Senator Leah Vukmir, a close friend of many Bradley operatives. Michael Grebe was on her 2018 U.S. Senate campaign steering committee, as was Mary Koehler, the widow of Terry Koehler, who was deeply involved with Bradley for many years. And the wealthiest women in America, the billionaire Diane Hendricks, a Bradley board member who was finance co-chair for the campaign. So there are ties, right? The New York-based Council on American Islamic Relations included Bradley among a list of donors that it says finance a vast network of individuals and organizations that spread prejudice against or hatred of Muslims in a 2013 report. Bradley has provided funding to a number of anti-Muslim groups, including $9 million to the David Horowitz Freedom Center, $1.4 million to Frank Gaffney's Center for Security Policy, and over $700,000 to Danley Pipe's Middle East Forum. Pipes has said Islam has, quote, nothing functional to offer, end quote. Horowitz, who CMD called out for his hate speech at ALEC last year. Also interesting that Horowitz was, invited to speak last year. He had never been on our radar in the past. but he has said, quote, "The Palestinians are Nazis. Every one of their elected officials are terrorists," end quote. Gaffney famously advanced a conspiracy theory that a crescent, sometimes seen as a symbol of Islam, and a US military badge was a sign of an impending Muslim takeover of the United States. So all of these groups are groups that have received Bradley funding. As you can see, that Bradley is incredibly influential in this fight on many different levels. And with that, I will turn it over to Max.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to make use of this share screen function and talk over it. So bear with me. And I think this is all going to work great. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is start off with a little story about my own time as a student activist engaged in protest speech. When I was a grad student, I and my cohort of activists, in an effort to raise awareness about the Israeli army's practice of home demolitions, went around to the dormitories at Northeastern University in Boston and distributed these to most of the dorms on campus. As you can see, one thing I really want to draw everyone's attention to is the bottom line here, which says, "This is not a real eviction notice." What happened afterwards, after we did this, was a sort of like barrage of news articles in right-wing outlets that started describing us as terrorists. The one I really want to draw attention to is the Frank Gaffney and Horowitz-supported magazine called Front Page Magazine. This is a publication of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, which again receives money, as David was just talking about, from the Bradleys. So I mean, this is a direct line. And again, the distribution of eventually, right, if enough right-wing outlets get their ducks in a row, mainstream news like NBC will pick it up. And I think so it's an important sort of understanding of how these things work. And I just want everyone to know that right now there are 3 different cases at US campuses right now where similar mock eviction notices were distributed, and the groups responsible for them have been banned and are no longer receiving university recognition or funding. So that is to say, their speech is being withheld. At Northeastern, within 2 days of this sort of media storm, every campus resident in our group who was visited by the Northeastern Police Department and harassed and intimidated. I think we have sort of very clear examples here of how this kind of thing plays out on campuses when Palestinian speech is involved. I wanted to start a little slideshow here. So after this happened to me at Northeastern, I began to research the groups who were attacking us. I started pulling their 990s, which I think is a thing that we can all do, especially the lawyers amongst us. It's a very fruitful way of understanding what we're up against. And this research became the basis of the Business of Backlash, a report that IJAM put out, which is out right now. You can find it via Google. But what we found is that these groups, and again, here are just some of the major ones and their assets. I think as we've heard already, the Koch brothers, especially through their foundations, can funnel money all over the place. And who do they fund it to? These are the what we call the agents of backlash. At Northeastern, Hillel and each had dedicated paid employees who were students who were paid by these organizations with money from those elitists that we were, those elite billionaires that in the previous slides, to monitor BDS initiatives. And when they happened, they were there to cry foul and drum up support for the kind of repression that we saw. This is just a small sampling of the amount of organizations that are funded exclusively through this network of billionaires that that we just mentioned. And I'm happy to make these slides. I'm sort of cutting through them quickly because I have a lot to cover, but I'm more than happy to share them with anyone and just get in touch via the chat or what have you. But as you can see, there's a bunch of these magazines that I was able to sort of trace all of the funding from to that same network. And I think let me just stop sharing. Oops.
It should be on top of your screen, Max.
Yep. How to, oh, stop share. Great. Are we back? Yes. Hi. So this sort of thing happens every day on college campuses. There is no more sort of restricted form of speech than pro-Palestinian speech on campus, I would argue, and I don't think it's close. And I would also say that what we see on college campuses is playing out in state and national legislatures as well. And it's easy to sort of just attribute all of this to something like APAC or the NRA, which I think SourceWatch does a great job of exposing as not actually the case, right? There is certainly a right-wing infrastructure, but there's also this astroturfing of a fake grassroots movement where if you just get enough people to say the same thing over and over again, you get what seems like grassroots support for these unconstitutional anti-First Amendment initiatives, like the one that we're seeing to criminalize BDS. I don't think it's a coincidence, right, that Marco Rubio now only gives press conferences in front of the Israeli and American flags, because Marco Rubio's #1 donor, Paul Singer and Sheldon Adelson, asked him to. That kind of funding is available through relationships like ALEC, actually, to any state or national elected official who is willing to sort of stake their public ambition on restricting sort of traditionally protected First Amendment ideas like boycott and critical speech. And I think another really important part of this is that the thing I mentioned about college campuses and the college campus police forces, when the police came to our our rooms, it wasn't white students. They really sort of focused in on the Black students in our group and the Palestinians in our group. And I don't think that's a coincidence, right? I think it's important to understand that the pointiest end of this stick always impacts our most marginalized members of our society. I think it would be, it's important to say that what SourceWatch does and what we have sort of here with these connections that we're making is an understanding that outside, there's not much safety in the First Amendment for activists. I think there's safety in a broad-based anti-racist movement that and joint struggle. And so it's important for us as activists, no matter what background we have, whether it's Palestinian activism, whether it's anti-fracking activism, whether it's pro-choice activism, that our enemies are all the same. And that's why these connections are really important to make, right? The same people who are seeking to promote right-wing speech and ban pro-Palestinian speech on campus are the same people who are seeking to ban protests at oil pipelines. And that, and since our enemies are the same, our coalitions sort of become stronger, and we're able to protect one another. The speech, I'm sorry, the group at my campus, the suspension wasn't lifted until we had members from all sorts of different struggles on campus joining with us in protest. We had unions on our campus who were very interested in the restriction of speech because so many of our adjuncts were attempting to unionize. We had Black Lives Matter folks and anti-gentrification folks working with us because they knew that the same people on campus who were seeking to shut us up had sought to shut them up when they were protesting the university's housing policies. These are important connections, and not just connections in name to make. I think these are the sort of backbone of our way forward through this. I think I'll end it there, but I'd love to take some questions. I see we're starting to get some. And I just want to lastly say that IJAN tries not to do panel discussions that are made up of all male presenting panelists. But when we do find ourselves on such panels, we do like to mention that it makes us, it's not ideal. And so as long as we're all clear on that, let's turn it over to the participants.
Okay, so thank you, Max. If anyone has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat function. So we've had a couple questions already that we've been trying to answer. One is about, okay, here we go. So we have, are any private police involved in the issues you have identified? Max or Ralph, anybody answer this? I don't know.
I don't quite understand what private means in this context.
Maybe like private university police.
I see.
Example, right? Like if you're at a private university, some of them have police forces.
So I mean, all I would say is that at Northeastern, the Northeastern University Police were a public police force, just one that was dedicated to that private university. However, I think what's important to understand here is that, especially for the lawyers who are participating in this, no matter where you are in this country, right, something like this is happening on a campus near you. We were very fortunate at Northeastern to have a really strong relationship with the Mass ACLU. And they, because Massachusetts has a state constitution that has extended First Amendment protections to private universities, they were able to make a lot of headaches for the university in their attempts to silence us. But I think that it would be important for you, if you have sort of free time and are interested in these kind of issues, to get in touch with your local chapters and see what your state constitution can do to help protect marginalized student speeches.
Ralph, anything to add?
To the private police force, just that after President Trump's executive order, it looks as though the federal government's positioning itself to force any university receiving federal funds, which includes now a lot of private universities, to comply with the founding premise of a lot of these bills. So whereas a lot of these, these bills create incentives to increase policing on students dissenting, as that sort of trickles into these private institutions, that will, those incentives will follow to those private police forces.
Okay, so Diana asks, I'm not sure exactly which bill she's referring to, so you might want to clarify, but authorize Washington bill authorized to restrict rallies on tribal lands. So if you could clarify which bill you're speaking of. Sam asks, how should academics approach these groups on their campuses, especially in their classrooms? So I'm assuming he's speaking about the provocateurs. Do you have a suggestion, Ralph?
It's really tricky for academics, and that's by design. So there's a question of strategy when a hate monger comes to campus. There's a moral imperative to try to neutralize their message. A lot of people feel, and so the challenge here is that that's being skewed as interfering with their free speech. So I think students are in a very students and faculty especially are in a very tricky position because these groups are out to retaliate against anything that you try to do. That's what these bills do, but also, Turning Point USA has shown that, they're willing to ruin someone's career because they got disagreed with on a campus. So I think, academics, the framing that's critical is that these are not academics in good faith coming. The strategic challenge, whether or not to go, or whether or not to disrupt, or whether or not to try to get, have a mass no-show, which honestly would be the most strategic thing, because these speakers are being paid and their metrics of success are how big was the counter demonstration. So it's a very much by design. It's a trap. I don't have a good answer, but just know that it's a trap.
Okay, Max.
Yeah, I would say the answer to that question for me would be very, very carefully. I think that there's a case, the case of Steven Salaita at the University of Illinois in Urbana. He lost his job. He's a tenure track professor who lost his job over pro-Palestinian tweets. The firestorm created by the same agents of backlash that I profiled became so much so that the university would rather fire him and pay him a large sum of money to never ever work again, than to respect academic freedom and his own tenure. So in the case of Palestinian speech, it's important to understand that tenure is not even enough to protect you in some cases, especially if you're in the case of Professor Salaita, a Palestinian man doing this kind of work. So I wouldn't, once again, I think that the lesson here is that tenure or the First Amendment or the sort of vague notion of academic freedom is not enough to protect you when dealing with these groups. You need you need to make sure you have a large backing of anti-racist groups who are doing work that are impacted by these people on campus.
Right. Good point. So Patricia asks, does anyone know who's paying for the riot boosting measure in South Dakota? I do not know offhand. You know, and one way to check is to see who the bill sponsors and, you know, sort of, you know, trace the campaign contributions to that particular legislator. But myself, I'm not sure the answer to that question. Max, Ralph? Okay. All right. One other question here we have is, oh, what's good? I missed it here. What resources and advice do you have for activists, college or otherwise, who are worried about surveillance, physical harassment, and/or assault? In terms of surveillance, I mean, are we talking about activists who are on campus? Because, I mean, even when I was on campus a very long time ago, there were cameras everywhere. You know, so I'm not sure the best way to avoid that in particular. Yeah, I don't know if I have many good suggestions. And most campuses nowadays have cameras really everywhere if you live on campus, right? And in terms of internet, I guess, like, if you're using campus internet, there's a lot of tools that you can use. You can use Tor, right? And VPNs to you know, prevent tracking of your online activities, right? If you're really serious, you can install Tails on a computer, you know, a specific operating system that prevents tracking. You know, so that's one thing. You can use Signal app, you know, for your text messages, for example. Any other suggestions, Max or Ralph?
We always tell students not to use their student email, the university issued emails, because those are university property. So if you're engaged in speech that the university might find objectionable, they will go through it and find out what you're doing.
I think, speaking to the critical necessity of coalitions that Max was describing, I mean, really, it's just important to make sure that it's not the most vulnerable people putting themselves on the front lines. Like, this is the role of allies, really, is to create a buffer between what could be, you know, direct violence by design and something a little less extreme. I don't know how to put that, but.
Mm-hmm. All right, are we seeing any other questions here? What is known regarding connectivity to financial industries shaping creation of debt and such things as fossil energy, private prisons, and guns?
I mean, besides our common funders, I think that's the answer, right? Like, it's no coincidence, and I think it's a one way that the Koch brothers work. I think they're libertarians, and they don't particularly care about, say, something like gay marriage, but they sure do love creating wedge issues for voters, right? So they fund things like Focus on the Family and the marriage defense front, that traditional marriage defense, because for people who would otherwise be voting against their financial interests, creating these sort of wedge issues and keeping them at the forefront is something that they can do to profit off of their more bread and butter issues like fossil fuels.
Yeah, I mean, you know, ALEC is another connection that comes to mind.
Right.
Although they've tried to distance themselves from guns and private prisons, and more recently, you know, they were behind the original Stand Your Ground laws, right? And, you know, Geo Group, I don't know what the latest, you know, incarnation of that company is, used to be a member, and of course, you know, fossil fuel companies are you know, supporters, and have been, you know, for many years. In terms of, you know, sort of financial industry shaping the creation of that, I haven't researched this enough. Okay. Last call for, oh. Somebody asked, isn't TransCanada giving a $20 million bond to state a bond? I'm not in a position to answer that question. Yeah. I would defer to Connor Gibson. Any other last questions? Okay, well then I just want to say, you know, thank you very much to Max and Ralph for your time. And again, to Sophia for setting this up and providing the technical assistance. And to all those who are viewing, I want to let you know that we are recording this, and we'll create a video that will be, you know, shareable in some form. And, you know, I hope we'll do it in a way that we can, you know, provide links to resources for you all. Okay. Thank you so much.